The suburbs of Houston sparkled with colorful lights twinkling on trees and fences, creating an illusion of festive magic. Children in costumes of witches, superheroes, and ghosts roamed the streets, laughing and dragging bags filled with candy. But not everyone was having a merry Halloween. Robert Harrison held his son Tommy's hand, while his older daughter Lizzie ran alongside. Tommy was dressed as a pirate, and Lizzie was a fairy, her glittering wings sparkling with every step. Robert tried to smile, maintaining the facade of festivity, but his eyes nervously scanned the streets. This Halloween felt strangely gloomy, as if the night itself hid something sinister. He couldn't shake the feeling, even though he didn't say anything to the kids. The last house on their list was the old, slightly run-down estate of their neighbor, Mr. Campbell. There had always been something odd about that man. Some in the neighborhood avoided him, saying he was not like everyone else. Yet the kids always got the best treats there. Robert hesitated to approach this year, but Lizzie rang the doorbell before he could voice his concerns. Campbell opened the door slowly, as if it took great effort. He silently stared at the children with his hollow, unmoving eyes. His hands trembled as he dropped pixie sticks into their bags. Robert noticed some fine white powder spilling from the wrapper, but he dismissed it. He hurriedly thanked the neighbor and led the kids away. At home, the atmosphere shifted. Instead of joyful candy unwrapping, silence reigned, punctuated only by the sounds of the television in the background. Robert left the kids in the kitchen and went to check the mail. Meanwhile, Tommy sat on the floor, opening one of the pixie sticks. "Look, Lizzie, I'll try it first," he exclaimed with excitement, ripping open the wrapper and pouring the powder onto his tongue. First, nothing happened. Tommy shrugged, as if the candy tasted strange but not bad. He was about to open another when suddenly his face contorted in pain. The boy clutched his stomach and began gasping. "Mom! Dad!" he whispered, collapsing to his knees. His body convulsed. His eyes rolled back, and foam began to spill from his mouth. Sarah rushed to her son, screaming, while Robert dashed to him with the phone in hand. "Tommy, can you hear me?" he shouted, trying to hold his son steady so he wouldn't hit his head on the floor during the seizures. "He's not breathing," Sarah cried out in a panic. Robert scooped his son into his arms and raced out of the house to the car. Sarah ran after him, desperately trying to reach emergency services, but the lines were overloaded. Halloween was one of the busiest nights for hospitals. Inside the car, an eerie silence filled the air, broken only by Tommy's gasps and Sarah's frantic breathing. Robert pressed the gas pedal so hard the engine threatened to rip itself apart, but the distance to the hospital felt endless. "Hang in there, buddy, hang in there. We're almost there," he repeated, as if those words could help. Sarah cried, squeezing Tommy's tiny hand. His body grew cold, and his skin turned pale as wax. Somewhere halfway there, his fingers slipped helplessly from his mother's grasp, and his chest stopped rising. "No, no, no, Tommy. Please not now," Sarah begged, her panic escalating. Robert slammed the car to a stop in the middle of the road and began performing CPR, ignoring the blaring horns from cars behind them. Sarah screamed into the phone, demanding help, but it was already too late. When the ambulance arrived, the medics could only confirm the death. Sarah collapsed on the spot, while Robert stood frozen, staring at his son's lifeless body with tear-filled eyes. The news of Tommy Harrison's death spread through the suburbs of Houston like a wildfire, plunging the town into deep fear. Parents anxiously checked their children's candy bags, hoping not to stumble upon anything horrific. The police announced an emergency sweep of all suites in the city, but it did nothing to quell the panic. A chilling dread hung in the air that a maniac was lurking among them, capable of coldly murdering children on Halloween night. The tension reached its peak when a report surfaced about a boy in a neighboring area who nearly ate the same candy. His mother, catching a sharp scent of bitter almonds, snatched the treats from her son's hands, and the shocking news confirmed their worst fears. The candy was laced with cyanide. Fear gripped everyone. Tommy's death had become not just a tragedy, but a signal of a serial poisoner who seemed to have deliberately chosen Halloween for his crimes. When the police visited Mr. Campbell, the Harrisons' neighbor, his behavior only added to their unease. He opened the door with a vacant, blank stare, as if he were oblivious to the events unfolding around him. During questioning, he stumbled over his statements, sometimes falling silent, hiding his face in his hands as if trying to shield himself from the horror. Nervous laughter occasionally escaped his lips, only to be followed by silence again as he rubbed his trembling hands. His explanations sounded absurd. He couldn't recall where he got those pixie sticks, even suggesting that someone had planted them on him. The police found old newspapers in his home with headlines about poisonings in other states, along with articles on mental disorders. Officers exchanged wary glances. Was he just a weirdo or a genuinely dangerous psychopath? If it is him, he's covering his tracks too well, Detective Brown thought. The atmosphere in the Harrison home grew increasingly unbearable, as if a fog of hopelessness was settling in. Sarah and Robert's grief tore them apart, turning every conversation into a bloody argument. "You let him eat that damn candy," Sarah accused, her voice trembling with rage and tears. Robert tried to defend himself, but his tone was laced with anger mixed with helplessness. He knew he could have prevented this tragedy, but time had slipped away, taking his chances with it. Additionally, financial problems weighed heavily on them. Robert worked at a car dealership, but his salary barely covered the bills. Sarah, having lost her job a few months ago, sought solace in alcohol, escaping from reality. The bank constantly sent threats about their debts, and the fear of losing their home pressed down on them from all sides. Lizzie, who had lost not only her brother but also her sense of security, rarely left her room, spending hours alone with Tommy's teddy bear, as if trying to preserve his spirit in her embrace. Despite the pain of losing their children, which should have brought them together, something between Sarah and Robert began to crumble. They were not only losing each other but themselves. Each day became a new trial where fear and hatred intertwined like a deadly dance. The police continued to delve into the lives of the Harrisons, trying to unravel the twisted web of deception, grief, and suspicion. During her interrogation, Sarah appeared outwardly composed, but every movement betrayed her inner despair. Her eyes, bloodshot from sleepless nights and tears, seemed vacant. She spoke softly, as if afraid that loud words would shatter her completely. "Robert has changed lately. He's become colder, focused only on money. I don't know if he was capable of something like this, but it clearly worried him more than before," she confessed, clutching her wedding ring. Her words hung in the air like a hint of something grim, yet she never dared to directly accuse her husband of their son's murder. The police exchanged wary glances. Grief makes people suspicious, but sometimes truth hides behind those suspicions. Robert, on the other hand, was cornered. He tried to defend himself, but his words came out muddled and unconvincing. "I took out the insurance well, in case something happened," he mumbled, but the detectives already knew about his financial troubles. His debts exceeded $50,000, and a payout from the insurance company after Tommy's death could resolve his problems once and for all. "It was just a coincidence," he repeated, but deep down, he felt his words sinking in his own lies. The moment came when the family said goodbye to Tommy. The funeral took place at an old cemetery on the outskirts of town. The gloomy sky felt heavy, like lead, and a cold wind pierced everyone gathered around the small coffin. The bright white casket bouquet sharply contrasted with the dark clouds rolling in. Among the crowd stood Sarah in a black coat, holding a picture of Tommy that seemed as alive and vibrant as the boy himself in life. She remained silent, like most attendees, because words felt powerless in the face of such grief. Nearby stood Lizzie, strangely detached, as if what was happening didn't concern her at all. She held a small bouquet of daisies, but her fingers were clenched so tightly that the wilted petals scattered to the ground. The girl hardly cried. She only brushed away a tear once when the wind tore the bouquet from her hands and scattered the flowers across the cemetery. When a neighbor approached Lizzie to hug her, she instinctively pushed him away. In her wide eyes flashed something cold, unusual for a child. She leaned closer to the man and whispered, "Soon we'll be rich." Her voice was calm, almost mundane, but the words pierced the neighbor like a blade. He recoiled and stared at her in disbelief. This detail sent an unsettling chill through many in attendance. Everyone knew that children could say strange things in shock, but something in her tone raised alarms. Detective Brown, standing off to the side, discreetly jotted down her words in his notebook. He tried to understand. Where did the girl's confidence come from? And why didn't she seem upset even at the funeral? After the ceremony, Robert seemed lost and exhausted. He stood by the coffin longer than anyone else, as if he couldn't bring himself to leave. His shoulders slumped, weighed down by some heavy burden. He nervously rubbed his fingers together, as if weighing something in his mind. Sarah stood aside, watching her husband with a look of anger. When everyone had dispersed, Detective Brown remained at the cemetery, observing as Robert and Sarah walked away, each in their own solitude. Something about this case gnawed at him. He couldn't shake off the thought of Robert, but the theory involving Mr. Campbell still held water. The police had two leads, but neither had yet led to the truth. As he delved deeper into the murkier corners of the story, Brown felt he was approaching something heavy and grim, a truth that could be even more terrifying than the murder itself. Robert woke up to the silence of the night, his thoughts continually returning to the tragic loss. Since his son's death, he hadn't been able to sleep well. Every sound in the house sent waves of anxiety through him, and this night was no exception. In the darkness, he heard quiet footsteps. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but as he listened closer, he realized someone was indeed wandering around the house. He quickly got up, absorbing the darkness around him, and headed toward the sound. The footsteps led to the hallway, and holding his breath, Robert saw Lizzie. She was tiptoeing quietly, hunched over as if trying to avoid detection. Robert's heart raced with alarm. Where was she going at this late hour? Trying to remain unnoticed, he decided to follow his daughter. Robert trailed behind her, making his steps light and careful so as not to startle her. Lizzie passed through the living room and stopped by the basement door. She glanced back, checking for anyone, then opened the door. A cold sweat broke out on Robert's forehead. What was she doing down there? He couldn't imagine what could possibly be in the basement at this hour. Lizzie slipped into the darkness, and without a second thought, Robert followed her. When he descended the stairs, he saw her kneeling by an old box filled with candy. "Lizzie!" he whispered urgently, but his voice felt too loud in the oppressive silence. She turned around with a strange expression on her face. Her eyes sparkled in the dark as she picked up another pixie sticks. "What are you doing down here? Where did you get those candies?" "The police took them away because they might be poisoned." Lizzie seemed unfazed, her smile still plastered on her face. "Mom told me to eat a few at night as a surprise," she replied, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. "When I eat them, you guys won't fight anymore. You'll love each other again, and best of all, we'll be rich." Those words cut through his mind like a sharp knife. Robert struggled to comprehend what was happening in his daughter's head. Could it be that Tommy's death was turning into something bigger and darker? "Lizzie, don't eat them," he shouted, snatching the candies from her hands. "It's dangerous. You don't know what they could do to you." She looked at him, her eyes flashing with something that resembled disbelief. "But Mom said it would be better this way," she whispered, a hint of hopelessness in her voice. Overwhelmed with horror, Robert threw the box of candies away. At that moment, a thought crossed his mind. Why did his daughter believe that happiness could be obtained through candy? After a night filled with anxieties and fears, Robert sought answers in conversations with Sarah. He sat at the kitchen table, his heart racing with thoughts about what had happened. When they began discussing their debts, Sarah seemed to let slip a hint that was unbearable. "Insurance payouts could cover our debts," she said despondently, unaware that Robert had grasped the implication of her words. That phrase hit him like a lightning bolt. He finally understood what she was trying to achieve, and his heart sank in his chest. Robert stood up from the table, the cold blade of suspicion piercing his thoughts. "You can't be saying that," he exclaimed, watching her face change as her eyes flared with despair. You weren't trying to. It was the only way out. Sarah interrupted, tearing off her mask of innocence. Tommy was just the beginning. If we don't claw our way out of this hole, we're all going to die. Robert felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He couldn't believe she would actually go that far. With the words she spoke, she had signed their fate in blood. Lizzie was supposed to eat a candy too, she shouted, her voice growing louder and more frantic. But she didn't get the chance. You can't imagine how necessary it was. At that moment, Robert realized this wasn't just a verbal clash. It was the beginning of the end. He tried to leave the room, but Sarah suddenly blocked him, grabbing a knife. In her eyes burned an unbearable fire. It was more than just a desire to protect herself. It was a desire to destroy. "You're not getting away!" she screamed, lunging at him, deliberately aiming for his hand. Robert screamed in pain as the knife bit into his skin, blood splattering against the wall. He grabbed her wrist, trying to wrest the knife from her grip, but she was stronger than he expected. "You ruined everything!" she shouted, her face contorted with hatred. Striking again, she tried to stab him in the neck, but he recoiled, knocking her off balance. They fell to the floor, and Robert seized the moment to snatch the knife from her hands. But Sarah wouldn't give up. She kicked at him, pinning him to the ground. Blood flowed down his arm as he clutched her wrist, struggling to keep her from breaking free. Every movement felt lethal. Robert could feel his heart pounding in his throat, trying to understand how this had happened. Finally, he managed to wrest the knife away and push her off. He fumbled to pull his phone from his pocket. He pressed the call button and shook the phone, trying to contact the police. Seeing him trying to call, Sarah lunged at him with renewed vigor, ripping the phone from his hands. She threw the device down, then slammed a fist into his stomach, blood flooding the space. Robert collapsed and silence fell. Sarah rushed toward the exit just as the door swung open. Officers responding to the call burst into the house while Robert lay bleeding on the floor. His heart barely beat, adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Police!" shouted one of them, apprehending Sarah. She struggled to break free, her screams and cries filling the room. The officers cuffed her, while Lizzie, quietly watching from a distance, looked at her mother with tears in her eyes, not understanding what was happening. A month after the horrifying events, Robert awoke in the dark, gasping for breath. His eyes fell on Lizzie's room, where silence reigned. He got up, trying to push away the heavy thoughts, and feeling a strange premonition, walked to her room. Lizzie sat on the bed, holding a candy in her hands. Her face glowed, and she smiled at her father. "I found it under the bed. I ate it so Mommy wouldn't be sad anymore. I missed her so much. Now she'll be happy, right? Now we'll be rich," she asked, as always with naive belief. In that moment, blood ran cold in Robert's veins. Panic seized him, and he instantly lunged for the phone, calling for an ambulance, but it was already too late. The poison he had tried to stop had already done its work. Lizzie, feeling her strength fade, smiled tenderly, whispering, "Mommy wanted this. Now everything will be okay." As her last breaths escaped her, Robert sat in the dark, holding his dead daughter in his arms. His world had shattered, and he felt the void consuming all hope and meaning. One question swirled in his mind: what did I do wrong? He was left alone in the silence, with an infinite loss. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. What would you have done if you were in Robert's shoes? And remember, sometimes the people closest to us can be more brutal than the most terrifying maniacs.